Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll be get starting in about 1 minute. We'll wait for a few additional folks to join us. Thank you again for your attendance this morning. Okay, I'm now going to turn it over to Jody Ginsberg, President of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and she will get us started this morning. Jody, over to you.
Thanks, Adam. I'm just going to try and start my video. If that could be enabled. For some reason, I'm not able to start my video. So I'm going to kick off. You'll just have to all imagine what I look like. While we get that sorted, my name is Jody Ginsberg. I'm the President of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our virtual panel discussion on Afghanistan's media crisis. 1 year after the Taliban's return to power, news outlets in Afghanistan are struggling to survive, faced with an increasingly censorious regime. Many of the country's most experienced journalists and media workers have fled, and the media, like much of Afghanistan, is grappling with the fallout from a collapsing economy. But as a report we at CPJ published last week shows, despite these challenges, Afghan journalists are finding ways to keep covering the news, whether from inside the country or from places of exile. During this virtual discussion, our fabulous panelists will take stock of the media landscape in Afghanistan in the year since the Taliban takeover, and discuss what can be done to make sure Afghan media continues to operate there. The format of today's discussion is going to be a 35-minute conversation with our panel, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Adam to take you through the logistics for the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Jody, you should now be able to start your video. There you go. A couple of quick logistic notes. Again, thank you for your attendance this morning. We do ask that if you have questions, if you can please hold on to those until the end of our presentation. You can make use of the raise hand feature within Zoom. That will flag for us that you have a question. You will also see a Q&A button in which you can type out any questions that you may have. And again, we kindly ask that you hold on to your questions until the end of our brief presentation. So thank you so much again for all of our panelists and for all of our attendees for joining us. Now I'll turn it back over to Jody.
Thank you. I'm really excited by the panel we have for you today. I'd like to introduce them now. Fareshta Abbasi is a researcher in the Asian division at Human Rights Watch. She focuses on research and documentation of ongoing abuses in Afghanistan. For the past 7 years, she's documented human rights abuses in Afghanistan with different organizations, including Human Rights Watch and the All Survivors Project. She was previously a legal advisor for the International Development Law Organization, where she trained and developed employees' legal skills within the Afghan justice sector. She holds an LLM in international law and strategic studies from the University of Aberdeen and was a Chevening Scholar in 2019 to 2020. And if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you after this panel discussion to read Fareshta's really powerful piece that she had published yesterday in the Hill political website, which articulates, I think, very powerfully the experiences of many Afghans who've had repeated experience of exile and then return and then exile again. And it's fantastic to welcome you today. We're also joined by Richard Bennett, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. He officially assumed duties on the 1st of May 2022. Richard has served in Afghanistan on several occasions in different capacities, including as the chief of the Human Rights Service with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. He also served with the UN as the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and head of the human rights component of peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and South Sudan, as well as twice in Afghanistan. And he has also held various senior roles at Amnesty International. And finally, Shafi Karimi is an award-winning multimedia journalist and writer who's been covering Afghanistan for the past 8 years, including reporting on the 2021 Taliban takeover. He's now based in France and works for a range of international outlets, including France 24 Television and Vice News. Shafi was previously based in Kabul, where he reported for RFE's Radio Azadi on television and radio, as well as Tolo News and Ariana News. Recent stories he's covered include the secret life of women soldiers and how lesbians are surviving Taliban rule, and he contributes regularly to Afghan social media forums. He's currently fundraising for the launch of the Afghan Journalist in Exile network. So welcome to you all. I want to start with you, if possible, Shafi. Our new report on the current media landscape in Afghanistan found that the Taliban has really escalated efforts to curb and censor any information that challenges its narrative of peace and stability and security across the country. You reported for us, for instance, that Taliban spokesmen had declined to provide information about the number of children. Oh, apparently tech issues. Shafi's having tech issues. So we will come back to Shafi. Apologies. I want to ask you the same question, actually, Fareshta, a similar question. We know that the media is facing huge challenges. We know the country is facing huge challenges. I wonder if you could outline some of the experiences that you're hearing from journalists in the media in Afghanistan in reporting and the kinds of censorship that they're experiencing.
Thank you very much, Judy, for having me in the panel today. It's very unfortunate to see Afghanistan's media 1 year after the Taliban takeover facing a lot of censorship, as well as the journalists. Because of those restrictions, the journalists have to compel themselves to self-censorship. I have been closely following and monitoring the restrictions that the Taliban have put in place on the freedom of media in Afghanistan for the past 12 months. I have talked to a number of journalists in Kabul and province of Afghanistan. And as you already mentioned, we have had a number of products and reports on the kind of difficulties that they're facing. One of the issues I would like to discuss today about is the progressive and vibrant media landscape that we used to have in the past 20 years in Afghanistan. We used to have a very progressive landscape where there were a number of media, not only a lot of TV and radio stations, and we do have a lot of independent journalists who are freely and independently reporting on the ground from Afghanistan. Since the Taliban takeover, there was a crackdown on the media in Afghanistan. The restrictions are that have been put has made it very difficult for the journalists to report in Afghanistan. What I have been told by the journalists is that because of all these restrictions, the local media is not able to report on anything critical. They are not able to report on any critical information. The Taliban have already banned and limited the number of programs that the media are allowed to broadcast, beginning from entertainment programs, including the music, movies, and in some provinces of Afghanistan, they have also been instructed that they are not allowed to bring women as either as a host or guest. Most of, I mean, as a result, these things are all happening in a humanitarian crisis situation. There is a humanitarian crisis ongoing there, and the female media workers are not allowed to go back to their work. These restrictions have made it difficult for the media to function. So, and I mean, the statistic shows that a number of media outlets have closed because they basically cannot function anymore. They cannot report independently anymore from Afghanistan. And it has become more difficult, and the restriction has been more severe on female media workers. One of the recent orders that the Taliban had regulated was that they instructed women in Kabul to cover their faces while they're on scene. So this basically, in very simple words, mean that they don't want women to have any face. They don't want women to have voice. They don't want women to have social presence, and that's what they have done. That's what actually they have pushed women back to their houses, and women in Afghanistan do no longer have social presence. Most of the female media workers are based in Kabul or the big cities. If you just go a bit far away from the center of cities in Afghanistan, if you go to the northern province and southern province, and you would see that the media has already died. You would see that most of the journalists are leaving and hiding. I don't want to say that being a journalist has ever been a safe job to do in Afghanistan. It has always been very dangerous and challenging, but for now it's one of the most dangerous things that you would like to do, because you could be easily detained, arrested, in some cases being tortured or even killed over reporting something that the Taliban deem that is critical. So according to the interviews that I had with the journalists in the province of Afghanistan, they have told me that they are not able to report on a number of issues. So, for example, no one is allowed to report on the opium cultivation in Kandahar, for example. In Helmand, journalists have told me that no one is allowed to report on the ban on girls' access to education. In Nangarhar, no one is allowed to report on the security situation. And as we all know, seeing the brave Afghan women on the streets of Kabul yesterday, no one is allowed to cover the female protests in Afghanistan anymore.
And first, I want to ask you what happens if people, and then I'll come to Shafi. Good to see you, Shafi. What happens when people try to do that, when people try to do that reporting? Because obviously some of our, the report that we produce from CPJ shows that people continue to try to report what's happening inside Afghanistan. What happens if they try to defy those kinds of edict or restrictions?
The journalists have been detained while they were trying to obtain information. In some cases, they have been tortured. I would like to bring one of the cases that we have been advocating for months now. It's about a very famous YouTube blogger in Afghanistan, Ajmal Haqiqi, who is in detention of the Taliban now. He has not been accused he still has not been accused. He does not have access to any lawyer or family member. This is basically what happens. And the journalists are being detained with no accountability. So the Taliban haven't responded to any of these advocacy calls, to any of these reports. They haven't held any of these members accountable for what is happening, and that's concerning, because some of the journalists that we have talked to who have been in detention of the Taliban for hours or days, in some cases they themselves even don't know why they have been detained or why they are being tortured. And I would like to also mention another case in Helmand in Afghanistan, while a social media influencer posted something critical about on the Taliban behavior and the food insecurity in Afghanistan. Hours later, the Taliban went to his houses, took him from the house, tortured, killed him, and then give the body back to the family. So the situation is really critical. So being a journalist in Afghanistan these days literally means that you're risking your life.
And then, of course, it creates an environment of self-censorship, because if you know that you potentially face torture or death, then the safest thing to do is not report, right? I want to come on to Shafi, and we'll come back to you, because I know, Fareshta, that you have some clear recommendations for what can be done potentially to address some of these things. But Shafi, I want to hear from you what you've been hearing about how challenging it is to report from Afghanistan, and then I'd like to ask you a little bit about what it's like to report from outside, but just your reflections on the challenges of reporting from within the country.
Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I'm very sorry that I joined with you later. As I mentioned before in the report that CPJ has published already in the website of CPJ. So last year on August 2021, when I want to work in a report about how many children were killed in winter last year in Kabul, I sent a message to the spokesman of the Taliban, and I asked him the question that I need for this information. And 2 days I was waiting for the response, but I doesn't give any response from them. And After that, I sent another message to Bilal Karimi, the other spokesman of the Taliban, and I asked him as well about this. I need this information for my report, but also I don't receive any response. And the other side, I sent a message to a doctor in the Indira Gandhi Hospital in Kabul, and he told me, yes, we have all this information, but the Taliban spokesman doesn't allow us, or we don't have this permission to give you this information. So what does it mean? That from here, from outside of the country, that I'm here, I'm living in France, and I'm working for 2 international agencies, and I'm writing reports for them. It's very difficult for me to have access for information inside Afghanistan. Even in this case, it's just a statistic about the children that they were killed in Afghanistan in the winter season. But the other side, we need to have access for information about the battles between the NRF and Taliban in Panjshir, and the other side about everything that's what's going on in Afghanistan right now. But from outside of Afghanistan, for me and for other journalists that they are working from here, it's very difficult for them because we don't know that what's going on right now in Afghanistan, and because the Taliban doesn't give us the information correctly, and we need to spend a lot of time to make a report to give the information from all the side of Afghanistan. So this is a big challenge for us from here.
And it's interesting you say that, because actually when we think about the challenges for the media, we're often thinking about the news reports about the journalists who are beaten or detained. Actually, I think we talk less about the challenges for the sources of your information, that they also are intimidated and prevented from sharing that information. I want to come back in a little while, Shafi, to talk about that experience as well and the challenges of reporting as an Exile journalist. But Richard, I wanted to move to you because one of the recommendations in our recent CPJ report that was directed at the Taliban is that they continue to facilitate your country visits, including the ability to meet privately with journalists and news executives to hear their experiences independently. I'm interested what you can tell us from your first country visit as special rapporteur in May, particularly as it relates to press freedom and journalist safety.
Well, thank you, Jody, for the question, and special thanks to CPJ for this event and for inviting me to be on this panel. I feel very honored to be alongside Fareshta and Shafi, and as Afghans and Afghan journalists, in Shafi's case, they're much better qualified than I am to comment on these matters. I did visit. I've been going to Afghanistan for almost 20 years. And I did visit in my new official capacity in May. As you've said, I was given access to the country. I met the Taliban authorities at senior level, foreign minister level, deputy prime minister and some other ministers, provincial governors and so on. And I was assured that I would have the freedom to meet people in private and to go places that I wanted to go. So there was a recognition of the mandate and of they already recognize UN human rights because UNAMA has a human rights a service that, if you mentioned, I'd once or twice headed up in the past. So the reception, I don't have complaints about the reception on my first visit. I was able to meet with a number of journalists in different parts of the country. I only had 11 days there, but I went to 3 different major cities. And I met journalists in all of them, including women. And they pretty much confirmed what the other colleagues, Fareshta and Shafi, have said, that life is performing as a journalist is extremely difficult for them, that there are many restrictions. It's maybe not impossible to report the news provided it does, or certain aspects of the news provided it doesn't contradict what the Taliban want, but there are no-go areas, and Shafi mentioned conflict areas, We know, and for those who follow Afghanistan closely, Panjshir and Andarab and a district, and also Baghlan in Saripur province have had some ongoing armed conflicts. It was also mentioned reporting on drugs is difficult, or if not impossible. And I don't think it was mentioned, but I would add that there are great concerns that when there is a complex attack, often it happens in a city like West Kabul, or sometimes in other cities like Mazar or Kunduz, journalists have been prevented from going to the scene and reporting on what took place, and I understand also prevented from going to hospitals and interviewing the wounded survivors or the families in the hospital. So there are many different barriers. I think that I just wanted to say that I think my sense is that, and then I'll stop. It seems to me that it's not just critical material that is not allowed, that is censored. It goes beyond that. It's even perhaps uncritical, factual coverage of situations that ought to be, that are news, like an explosion at a school or something like that, an attack on a school, even though it may not be a critical coverage. And certainly from what I was told when I was there and talking to journalists since, investigative journalism is not allowed at all. And it's really that there's control over any kind of difference of opinion or difference of view or reporting difference of view. It doesn't need to go as far as dissent. It's just not following a party line. And then finally, yeah, I'll stop there.
Sorry, I was going to say, and I think that's crucial, right? I think sometimes, again, we can focus on the impact that that's having on journalists, but actually the reason that we all consider journalism to be important and vital is because that's crucial information for the people of Afghanistan to make decisions about their lives, to know where is safe to go. So, even if it's not about dissent, but about, just basic safety, basic access to aid, for example, that's crucial information that they are without if people can't report on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a crackdown on access to information that has direct implications on people's safety, as you pointed out, and on their human rights if they don't know where to get aid. So the crackdown on access to information, as well as on expression and movement and so on, it has that general impact on the people of Afghanistan. And of course, I would say that there's been a dissolution of all of the institutions of accountability as well as information. So when you don't, and one of those is journalism, but also civil society as a whole. And I work particularly with human rights defenders. They, just like journalists, need access to information, and just like journalists are forced to find ways to get information remotely. And I think Afghanistan's not the first country where this has happened. Syria comes to mind a decade ago and ongoing, where both human rights monitoring and journalism has had to be done in different ways because of the challenges faced by authorities not allowing access to information.
Thank you, Richard. And we'll come back a little bit, I think, to talk about what more you think can be done to improve the human rights situation more generally in Afghanistan. But first, I wanted to turn to you now to get your sense of what needs to happen now to improve the situation for journalists and the media within Afghanistan. Obviously, we've talked about the challenges that come from the edicts from the Taliban, the behavior of the Taliban, but equally there is no money anymore for journalism. The economy has collapsed, and the sort of media development money that was flowing into the country to support media has also largely gone. So what do you think are the steps that the international community, the community within Afghanistan, can take to support media and promote the safety of journalists?
It's a very difficult question to answer, Judy, because I mean, considering the restrictions that are there, considering the Taliban's behavior in the past 12 months, they have clearly proved that they're not serious about protecting or respecting human rights. So it's going to be, it's a very difficult question to sketch and try to bring some solutions. But what I believe in is that as far as the Taliban wants to have, they're willing to have international engagement, it means that we do have leverage over them. I think one of the priorities of the international community now should be that they have to bring the freedom of media on every agenda. Every time that they're visiting Kabul, every time they're meeting the Taliban, they have to make it clear for the Taliban that the freedom of media is something that they care about, and it's fundamental, and it should be restored. They have to make it clear for the Taliban that the media has to be free in Afghanistan, and the journalists have to be able to report freely from inside Afghanistan. They have to make it clear for the Taliban that they have to end the arbitrary detention of the journalists. They have to end torturing the journalists, and they have to let the journalists to be able to report from the ground, because I mean, one of the most concerning thing right now is that the way that it has impacted our work as human rights organization, as Richard has gone through this topic in details about how access to information has become very limited in a human rights crisis, in a humanitarian crisis situation. We need the local media to function. We need them to be on the ground and to report what is happening. We need them to monitor and let us know what is happening there. And while everything is being censored, while people fear their own safety, they do not talk to medias or human rights organization about what is happening. While the journalists cannot do anything, I'm afraid we're diving into another crisis. So what I would like to emphasize on is that we definitely need the pressure from the international community on the Taliban to make sure that the media can function properly. For this, we have been suggesting a practical step. So recently, we have called on the UN Security Council to impose travel ban on the individuals of the and the Taliban leadership that are responsible for the human rights abuses, including the abuse of policies on the media in Afghanistan. We also would like donors to make sure that they support local media inside Afghanistan. As I have talked to a number of media outlets in Afghanistan, some of these stations have closed because they're running out of budget, because there's no financial support and resources available. And I would like the donors' attention to make sure that those outlets are still functional or still Afghanistan have the appropriate financial resources to do that. But adding to all of these, I mean, I don't want to divert the attention, but adding to all of these, what I'm fearing is that what I'm really scared and fear is the journalist safety inside Afghanistan. We also want the international community to open their borders to at-risk journalists and to make sure that they reach safety.
Thank you. And that echoes entirely what we have called for at CPJ. And we continue to receive really heartbreaking requests from journalists from inside Afghanistan who are clearly at high risk, looking for paths out of the country, and really struggle to get many in the international community to respond to that. Shafi, you are a journalist in exile. I wonder if you can talk about what that experience has been like, and perhaps reflect on some of the experiences of other colleagues who have gone into exile and what needs to be done to support journalists, Afghan journalists in exile.
Thank you. I want to mention that it's okay that many of journalists right now, they're living in Afghanistan, they are trying to leave Afghanistan, but some of them, they don't like to leave Afghanistan. They were They want to stay in Afghanistan and they want to doing reporting from Afghanistan. But what's the big problem for them right now in current situation? It's a financial problem, as Shajan also mentioned, that they need for supporting from our side, from the international organization, and from the countries of the world, that they have this decision that they want to stay in Afghanistan and they continue their work from Afghanistan. But without financial support, it's not possible. So the first thing that I want to talk in here, it means that please help with the journalists that they want to stay in Afghanistan. It means financially help and also support them. And also for me, as I'm living in here in exile, a big challenge is for me in here, as you know, I'm living in France, and it's very difficult for me to learn the French language very fluently in here and very quickly in here. It is the same problem, not for me, for all the journalists that they left Afghanistan and they're coming in France, Germany, Netherlands, and all the European countries. So it's a big problem for them to at first learn the language of the country. And secondly, it is not very easy to find a job in these countries. Like, and especially as a journalist, it's not easy. You need to try too much, and you need to learn the language. You need to find an opportunity. So it will take a lot of time. It means that in here also the journalist needs for supporting. I want to ask you and also Richard and all the audience that they are looking our meeting. I want to tell for all of them that these journalists also need for your supporting, for you know. So we know that in every side of Afghanistan right now, the Taliban unfortunately killed some people, beaten some journalists, arrested some journalists. It's the situation that's right now going on in Afghanistan, but it's our responsibility to make reports from here about them. So without supporting, it's not possible for us to do these things in here from exile.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we've been very struck by, actually, is how many of those journalists who have gone into exile want to continue to report on what's happening as far as possible within Afghanistan for their communities, for many people. And I think it's easy to forget that going out of Afghanistan doesn't necessarily make all of the problems go away, because the challenge of being in exile are huge, and many people remain in limbo because they're not able to get visas into third countries, so they remain in refugee camps in really quite dire straits. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that. We think once people have left, the problem is solved, but that's not the case. We have about 5 minutes of discussion. If you want to ask a question, there's a Q&A function in Zoom. Please ask your question there, and we'll come to your questions shortly. Richard, I want to turn to you to talk about human rights specifically. You and other colleagues have raised the alarm about the deteriorating human rights situation in Afghanistan. What are the promising things that you think might happen to improve the situation?
Thank you, Jody. I think it's, a year after, it's a somber moment, the year after that, because there are not so many promising situations. But I did want to pick up on a point that you made earlier about my access, and actually a point that you made about the role of the media being to provide information that is to Afghans, which is about their welfare. So I think that given that although the Taliban are not recognized as a government, they are in office, they're in power, and at the moment they have to be dealt with, that the point that you made could be pursued further. And when it comes to journalism, as to human rights, there is a kind of business case for it. That if we're looking for, I'm not sure it's promising, but I think it's something that ought to be explored, that to present that providing information to the people of Afghanistan will make governing the country much easier than it would be by not providing it. It would make security and safety and issues of humanitarian issues better. If you know where you can go to get food or to get other non-food items that are necessary in a humanitarian emergency. So I think the starting point would be, are there any, a positive starting point, are there any openings? Are there any kind of low-hanging fruit that could be addressed in this environment, which is overall repressive, and then maybe work from that, begin with some few successes if they're doable, and work to that. So I think that's what I'd say about promising. The other thing that I think is positive is that journalism hasn't died. Media workers are still doing their best and doing so extremely courageously, and working in the country and abroad, and working together at times. So I know that that the fact that the light is still shining because of the determination, persistence, and skills of media workers is another promising sign. And then I'm not going to let this go, and I'll stop there without mentioning the issue of accountability. I agree with what Fareshta and Chafi have said about the situation and the recommendations that need to be made. But those that do harm to journalists need to be held accountable. They need to be properly investigated, and they need to be brought to justice, because that can be a deterrent. If there's a complete climate of impunity, then the spiral will keep going, where journalists will be threatened and assaulted and tortured and possibly killed. But if there is the chance of accountability, and ideally more than a chance, real accountability, and I think the international community needs to come in here, then I think that can help turn things around a little bit. Thank you.
Richard, how do you see that accountability being achieved? I mean, impunity is one of the things that we talk about endlessly at CPJ, that you know, a culture of impunity in which crimes against journalists go unpunished simply encourages more crimes to be committed. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in many countries around the world. In a country like Afghanistan, which is in such turmoil, how is accountability for crimes against journalists realistically achieved?
I think I mentioned the international community. I mean, first, and I'll stay with that. I think there are international justice mechanisms that can be brought into play. But the international community also has some political leverage. We know that the Taliban want recognition, and it has financial leverage as well. And Fareshta mentioned amongst the political leverage, the travel ban. But I think these kind of things can be brought into play. And I do think that there needs to be carrot and stick. I talked a moment ago about setting out some opportunities where journalism can help with governing the country and keeping people safe. At the same time, there needs to be a level of accountability. Now, I've talked about international, and nationally, there needs to be the rebuilding of a system of justice according to international standards and according to the human rights treaties that Afghanistan have ratified. And I said at the beginning that the the Taliban leadership told me that they do recognize their international treaty obligations. So let's hold them to that and create a fairer system of justice internally where people are held to account for doing harm to journalists.
Thanks, Richard. We'll move on to our questions now. I have many more questions, but we have a couple from the chat. One is for you, Fareshta, which is it getting worse to be a journalist in Afghanistan, or can we hope for some improvement?
I think I mean, we have already discussed about this question. How difficult has it become to work as a journalist? We have seen that I mean, a large number of journalists have lost their jobs in Afghanistan, and either because that the media outlet is not working, or because it's not safe for them to work in this sector anymore. In terms of improvement and hoping for a better future under the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, I would like to go back to the role of international community to put pressure on the Taliban, as Richard have already talked about it. One of the things I would like to say, not only emphasize on the role of the international community, but I would like also to mention this, that I mean, 1 year after the Taliban takeover, Afghanistan is experiencing the worst humanitarian crisis, the worst human rights crisis right now. And I think it's time for the Taliban also to reconsider their priorities in Afghanistan. There is the food insecurity ongoing, people are dying out of hunger, and to address this humanitarian crisis, the Taliban need to engage with the international community. I believe that the international community's message to the Taliban was clear in the past 12 months. The international community has made it clear to the Taliban that they won't engage with the Taliban as far as they restore the fundamental rights of Afghans. And I believe this is the time for the Taliban to rethink of all of these and end these human rights abuses in Afghanistan, so the international community can address the humanitarian crisis. What wonders me in this situation is seeing that while people are dying out of food, in need of food and hunger, the Taliban or the Taliban's priority is to put more restriction on women, on media, and on other different aspects of the citizens, individual rights of Afghan citizens. So what I'm seeing here is two sides. We do need the Taliban to understand this, and then we do need the international community to stand by and support the people of Afghanistan. I think you're muted, Judy.
Thank you. I knew I would not get through an entire Zoom session without doing that. Apologies. You mentioned the impact of these additional restrictions on women journalists. I'm curious first, and then perhaps Richard and Shafi, you might also have reflections on this. What impact that those restrictions, those gendered restrictions, have more broadly beyond the impact, obviously, that they have on the journalists themselves? What impact does that have on broader Afghan society?
I think the impact is huge. It impacts on different ways. So first of all, we do not have that landscape anymore. So the media itself was represented, I would say, different things for Afghans. It was an opportunity for employment for both women and men in Afghanistan. It was a platform to learn. It was a platform to reflect the local voice. I mean, Afghanistan has never been in an ideal situation. It has been in conflict for the past 20 years. So and it was also a place and a moment for Afghans to get together and enjoy that programs and everything that was happening there. I do remember that I don't remember exactly which year was, but Shafi may remember it. But I do remember when the Afghanistan football team, for example, made it the champion of the South Asia. So I remember that moment of joy while everyone was, and then the media was the only way to connect us to a world outside Afghanistan. We have been living under. We have been living in a city under attack. We have been living and working for a better future amid all those explosions and all of those. And I think media was one of the biggest achievements of Afghan people in the 20 years. And it breaks my heart to see that we don't have it anymore. It's very difficult to see that the media is collapsing, and it's difficult to see that most of Afghans do not have access to those platforms anymore. I believe that the media had a huge impact on Afghan's life, and that part is gone now. That learning part, that joy point, and also a huge financial supports for most of the media workers are gone now.
And that's such a powerful reflection, because we've talked about the importance of journalism to provide news about what's happening. We've talked about the importance of providing basic information. We talked about that with Richard, and the ability to provide information about how people live their lives. But we also forget that it can be a really powerful unifier, a place to celebrate, to come together as a community. Shafi, what do you see as the major impact of this decline of the sector as a whole on the broader Afghan society?
Thank you. Trish also told you about that, and also I want to talk about it later. When I was in Afghanistan, I worked with Flow News, with Ariana News, and also with Radio Azadi in Kabul. So on these three biggest channels in Afghanistan, we made a good connection with all the journalists, and we was a good community, and we worked together, and we share everything together, and we discuss about everything on that time. So, but for now, there's nothing, and we lost everything. There's no community between the journalists right now, and in the current situation, I think we lost everything, and in Afghanistan, many journalists don't have hope for their futures because of the current situation. And you know, so before, when I talk with students in universities, mostly women students, girls, they have lots of plans for their futures. Some of them told me that we want to become journalists in the future. We want to present some news in television, or be reporting from Afghanistan. So, but for now, when you want to talk with someone in Afghanistan, mostly with the girls in Afghanistan, they don't have any plan for their futures. Most of them can't go out from Afghanistan, from their home, sorry. So, but for now, as you know, in televisions in Afghanistan, the women must cover their face with the mask. So they need to present the programs with the mask. I think for now, if it's going like this, and I think a lot of girls in Afghanistan, they don't have any plan for their futures right now, and even most of them want to leave Afghanistan right now. So if it's going like this, I think in some months, or in maybe in 1 year, we don't have anyone, like mostly women in the televisions in Afghanistan. So and even in other organizations in Afghanistan. So I think this is maybe the most impact. It's a negative impact in the current situation, on mostly for women, even for boys as well in Afghanistan.
And the tragedy of that, and Faresta, you referenced this in your article yesterday, is the enormous progress that was made over the past 20 or so years, where so many people could engage, men and women could engage in the industry and see themselves as having a career and move forward. And that extinguishing of hope is what I think is so tragic. We have a hand up, I think, from the audience. So we have a question from Anis Rahman Shinwari. If you want to ask your question, please go ahead.
Much. Do you hear me? Yes. Do
Yeah, we
you
hear you.
hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, okay, thank you, thank you. My name is Anisur Rahman Shinwari. I am basically I am from Nangarhar province, and I have 2 degrees in the media. One is from the University of Peshawar, Pakistan, and the other is from the Asian College of Journalism, India. I have 12-year experience in the field of media in Afghanistan. I have a little bit some concern on the organizations where they didn't reach on the time on the Afghan journalists. The whole world knows that the Afghanistan situation was not good, and maybe you know that many journalists still stuck in the Afghanistan and many more in the neighbor countries, especially in Pakistan and Iran side, and many of them are in Doha camps. So CPJ, RSF, IFJ, many organizations did their great job and they provided financial support, but financial support is not enough for their life. They want a security and a secure place. So what is the plan and what is what they have these organizations to evacuate these journalists and provide them as a safe place in the different countries where I know many journalists have their pending cases, and there is many journalists in Islamabad who are stuck and they are making protests day by day, but there is no any organization to hear their voices. So why these organizations are silent on the Afghan journalist situation? Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. I can talk a little bit from a CPJ perspective. It's absolutely the case that many journalists who have been able to leave Afghanistan find themselves in this very difficult situation where they're often in a second country awaiting processing of visas to a third country. And one of the things that we have been consistently lobbying governments, and particularly those members of the Media Freedom Coalition, to do is speed up that process. It's been incredibly difficult to process people through on that. Richard, I'm curious from your perspective, as someone who has long experience in the human rights space, what more can the international community do specifically to support those who find themselves in this really difficult limbo situation?
I think that the international community needs to give a lot more thought to protection issues. There are responsibilities that they have to protect journalists and others who are threatened, and those who are in a limbo, as others have said, do need to be taken care of. There need to be places made available through immigration routes so that they have secure locations. And even then, as Shafi has said, and he's moved to France, and there are many issues of resettlement. It's not just taking Afghans or anyone else across a border. If there are differences in language and culture, they don't want to have miserable lives in their new countries. They need to be given the opportunities to thrive and to be seen as assets. Most Afghans, I think, will be grieving that they had to leave their homes. Let's not, as the international community, make it worse by making their lives equally difficult when they move abroad, because they're forced to. So that would be what I would say the international community needs to do more to protect, but also more to resettle.
And of course, they're often having to leave not necessarily because of a broader humanitarian crisis, although that may be the case as well, but sometimes because they're specifically at risk because of the work that they do as journalists, as human rights defenders. And I think that's where we perhaps don't see as much focus. I think sometimes these crises tend to get lumped together and seen as broader humanitarian crises, without perhaps a recognition that some individuals and some groups are particularly targeted for the work that they do. We are coming to the end of the session. I would love, Fareshta Shafi, for you to perhaps share your last thoughts with the audience before we close. Fareshta, let's start with you.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you very much. I just would like to take this moment to share the solidarity with all Afghans who are still in Afghanistan. I know yesterday and today has been very difficult for all Afghans inside Afghanistan and outside. I would like to let them know that our hearts are with them, and my heart is still in Kabul, and it has been a very difficult day. I'm so glad to be able to spend some of today with the CPJ and with this wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Shafi, a last word from you.
Thank you so much. Just I want to mention that a lot of journalists in Islamabad, in Iran right now, they are living in a very bad situation, because every day I receive a lot of message and calls from them. And the need for really for the supporting to evacuate from Pakistan and Iran. So because there are not one or two or three journalists, there are more than 100 journalists that they are still for more than 9 months and 10 months in these two countries in a very, very bad situation. Even they don't have a place for living. They're living in outside in streets. So I from here, I want to ask from all of the international communities, mostly from you, from Richard, that he is in here, to please support them and please find a way for evacuate of them. And thank you so much. At the last, I want to just tell you that why I make AGN, Afghan Journalists in Exile Network. That's I'm in contact with all the journalists in a community of the journalists that they are still living in France in here. They want to help those journalists, but we can't do it independently with 5 or 6 journalists. We need to receive a lot of support from your side. Together we can help all of these journalists inside Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and it was a very good meeting with you. Thank you.
Thank you to all 3 of our panelists for giving us your time today. I know you're all very busy. I know this has been a challenging period, and I'm extremely grateful. Thank you to you. And please do, if you haven't already read it, check out our report on the media situation in Afghanistan, and we will continue to push for improvement inside Afghanistan and outside. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jody, and congratulations on your report. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.